we didn't really know that they were going to sell the mill, and that all kind of happened to us without us being aware that the mill was for sale. And the company bought the mill, and and I like the new term, it's deconstruct instead of construction, or the wrecking ball, they call it the deconstruction. And they really have started that process, although to this stage they haven't done anything in the mill that cannot be undone. Right now they only have a permit, for example, to remove the asbestos and a lot of the pipes and things like that, and those would have to come out of the mill anyhow. So at this stage they have not done any major damage to the mill. It is in far better condition, and we had an assessment done of the mill itself by an architectural firm, and that's just been completed, and they came back with it, a complete assessment, and said the mill could certainly be saved, that it was not something that could not happen. Now, a lot of stuff in it is very unusual. There are 5 freight elevators in the building, and they really are all workable. One of them they're using right now, even with what they're working in there with. And the problem you have, and it has 300,000 square feet in it. So now what do you do with 300,000 square foot building? And so that's a major problem. The other problem that we're facing, and we haven't said a lot about anything that I'm telling you, is the footprint, and that's where the mill actually stands itself. And the guy that bought the mill to deconstruct it, he really only bought the footprint of the mill. So that means all the land around it and the warehouses that you see are not owned by him. They're still owned by one of the other parties. And then another problem was a lot of the bits and pieces of the land has been sold off, and of course all of the town has been sold off to individuals. And so if you go in, for example, and one of the suggestions we've had made is that you take the top 2 floors and put a hallway right down through the center of it and condominiums on each side, and then put windows like the original windows back in the building. And if you had one of those condominiums on the top floor of the mill, you could look out the window and you could see the whole city of Jackson, because that would be the view you'd be looking at. And of course the same thing would be in the back. You would be looking over the mill pond itself and the cooling ponds that were behind it. So the sites would just be magnificent. And then there's been many suggestions. We've had about 5 now investors come in and look at the building and the property to determine what we could do with it if we saved it. And that is a major contention of what do you do with such a large amount of property. And then, since it's not all in area, what would you do for parking? You have to come up then with places for people to park, and he doesn't own any land with the mill, and so you would have to buy additional land. Right now we're looking probably at about $2.5 million to do the things that I've already said and get the mill. We're looking at almost $18 million to totally restore the building and make it into some kind of condominiums or shops and things like that. But it is a doable project. It's just finding the right combination of people, and then a lot of it would be taken down anyhow. One is this office that we're going by right now. That's not an original part. The old office is the first one that we came through, so these would actually come down anyhow, and so would the cooling towers that you see here. There are 3 of those, and they were not a part of the original mill. The mill itself has 2,500 bricks in the building, and they're handmade bricks. They really have already been sold to a firm in Baton Rouge, and if they take it down, the bricks would be going to the firm there. We won't really ever see what's called the deconstruction. The company that owns it now, that is what they do. And so they certainly know how to go about the deconstruction of the mill itself. The land across the street was the original parking lots when they had cars, and that belongs to a separate individual also, and half of that has been sold to the Methodist Church, and so they own a part of it. The mill ponds right in behind the mill and the cooling ponds and that land has been sold to a preacher in Cincinnati. He grew up here and he bought that land, and so that's not as big a problem as anything else, because he's willing to work with us, and it would give us back the mill pond and things like that. where we are now, and that's kind of what we're going to do, the schools were here. The Bemis Company operated its own school system outside of Madison County, and directly across this field on this side was the elementary school where I went to school, and then across the street there were two other school buildings. The oldest school building was there, and then a second school that we called the stucco building all the time was there, and then in behind it was the cafeteria. And I can smell the Friday soup right now. So every kid lived for Friday because it had soup and fruit and peanut butter cookies. So they would march us across over there to eat every time. The whole system was fed there, actually. One of the things I was thinking about last night, and that had been my plan all along, is just tell you all of my memories of the town and what happened. I can remember this, and Sadie, you remember the lady who gave the shots all the time? She was 8 foot tall and weighed about 500 or 600 pounds, and they and they marched us across to the cafeteria in line, and you could hear every kid taking his shots, you know, crying and carrying on, and you stood there petrified that you were next up in line to take the, and the needle was at least a foot long. I know it was that long. On this side, that is the water purification building that you see there. All the water was pumped in and purified. The wells were here. Although the mill operated off of the water that came from, I want to say Coon Creek. Anyhow, the creek, whatever it was. And Cane Creek, that's right. And up the mill, we're fixing to cross the Cane Creek now. It's a flowing all the time, and the company had built a dam. And there are actually aqueducts that come from that dam to the mill pond to furnish the water for the mill, because it was steam operated, of course, in the beginning. There was no electricity. It produced its own power all the time. And we fished and played in the mill pond all the time. And someone had sent us a picture recently, and I know it's the Heron Chapel Baptist Church, and they were baptizing in the mill pond, which would be a very, very common deal. These were the garages where all the trucks were kept for the maintenance, and the town, the city of Bemis maintained everything. If you lived in a Bemis house, your house was painted every 5 years, and the inside was painted every 5 years, and the floors were sanded and redone, and whoever was living in the house got to pick the actual colors of the paint itself. And so these are part of the shops of those. Joel asked me some time ago to speak to the Bemis Historical Group about my life in Bemis, and I just made a comment to him. I said, Joel, my life was like everybody else's life in Bemis. I didn't have a different life. And he said, yes, you did, Bill. 3 generations of your family worked for the Bemis Company, but never in the mill. And that never had occurred to me that we didn't do that. My grandfather came here to be the farmer. Bemis owned 600 acres of land, and we actually farmed that land, and the equipment was kept in my lifetime in that particular building. And I always like to tell this story. I can remember the very first tractor that Bemis bought, and it was a red International, but all the Bemis colors were forest green, so they painted that brand new International tractor forest green. These were where the cotton came in when they were buying it, and my grandfather oversaw that too. And there was a grading house here, and as the cotton was brought in, they would bring it here. What most people don't realize is that Bemis bought a tremendous amount of cotton. They didn't just buy it for this mill, they bought it for their other mills, and not only that, they sold cotton all the time. The cotton raised in Madison County in this area is the highest grade cotton raised in West Tennessee and most of the South. And so they would grade that cotton here. And several years ago, Queen Elizabeth and Prince Charles came and visited these grading houses here in Bemis. So they were right there on those platforms. That's where they were. Some of the oldest section of the town is over here. Right now, we're fixing to cross Cane Creek. Over on this side was the cattle farm where the cattle was kept. You could bring your milk cow to Bemis with you. And they had a barn here, and you could put your milk cow in the barn and had a place to graze him. They would cut it for hay, which my grandfather did all the time. And we played in those cow barns. Of course, we played in the creek, but we didn't call it Cane Creek. That's why I kind of missed it for a minute. We called it Sugar Creek's what it was called. And there was a specific reason for that. Do you know what it was? The sewage system dumped into the creek. It had been cleaned. This is Dee, you cannot repeat that I said this.
Do I need to cut the camera off?
Yes.